claims that Augusto del Noce was the most important thinker that no one has heard of. Grant was right in a certain sense, but also wrong, because more and more people are, in fact, discovering del Noce. They're discovering him because of the translating work and the interpretive work of a professor of mathematics at the College of Staten Island at City University of New York, who primarily works on mathematical physics. But we won't be hearing today from him regarding non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and macroscopic physical systems. At least I don't think we'll be hearing about those things, but we'll see. Rather, our guest and friend of the Collegium Institute, Carlo Lancellotti, will speak to us about del Noce, and more importantly, on atheism as del Noce says, the most characteristic phenomenon of our time. And hopefully, as we reflect on del Noce and on atheism with Professor Lancellotti, we'll also get a sense of how Christians can understand and respond to the phenomenon of atheism in our time. And so it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Professor Carlo Lancellotti.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I think I have about 12 minutes to give some introduction to del Noce and atheism. I mean, this is the third book that I translated by del Noce, and it's not the one I would recommend to be the first to it, because it's harder. The first I translated was meant to be an introduction, easier to read. This is kind of hard, but this is the book where del Noce really talks about atheism, so this is the topic which we have been given today. Del Noce wrote this book in 1964, and it's kind of a symbolic date because it is the kind of the conjunction between the world of totalitarianism, Second World War, Nazis, Stalinism. Stalin was in 1953, and then the 60s. The 60s is our world in a sense. I mean, it's the world of the sexual revolution, the world of scientism, the world of, it's in many ways the world in which we live. And del Noce was a very political and historical thinker. He was not interested in atheism in a 10,000 feet way. He was interested in atheism also because of its impact on the culture and its political impact even. And so for him at the time, the prototype of atheism in a sense was Karl Marx, which is kind of unusual because people would think Nietzsche and Kant or other people. And to him, the most interesting thing was that atheism seemed to be spreading around, right? In the 60s, there was this impression that the whole world, in a sense, was marching in the direction of greater secularity. And so he wanted to understand this. And so this is why he wrote about this topic. So that's the first thing. You have to put his approach to atheism is historical and political, not just philosophical. Now I'm going to give 2-3 basic points that he makes about atheism. His interlocutor, the person he was talking to, was in some sense Maritain. Maritain was both his teacher, the great French Catholic philosopher, and also the target of his critique. Because Maritain had diagnosed that atheism, Marxist atheism in particular, is not deeply philosophical. It's more like a moral reaction. Marx reacts against the bourgeoisie, the hypocritical Christianity of the rich people, and so he denies God in order to deny the whole establishment of religion, society, the young song, and del Noce disagrees. Del Noce thinks that modern atheism is profoundly philosophical, and also including Marx. He also thinks that it is a new phenomenon. In the chapter that I suggested for reading, I know it was readable enough because they don't print dense. He says that, in his opinion, the atheism in the modern sense is a post-Christian atheism, right? In the sense that, in his opinion, there is no atheism in antiquity or in the Middle Ages in the same way as we know it today. Why? Well, because first of all, Christianity brought a new idea of God, a new concept of God, right? If you look at the Greeks and the Romans, they had notions of the divine and they had deniers. But if you were an atheist in Roman world, you might deny the gods, right? You denied the gods, but the gods were in some sense part of the cosmos, right? I mean, or even the Aristotelian, what's the immobile mover?
The unmoved mover.
Unmoved mover, still in some sense is not transcendent, right? You could argue that in Plato there is a hint of transcendence already, right? But by and large, according to the notion, the ancient world did not know transcendence, did not know the notion of the fall, did not know the notion of redemption, the notion of grace, right? So in the notion view, modern atheism is an atheist that responds to this fundamentally Jewish and Christian notion, right? Transcendence, creation, fall, redemption, grace. If you don't understand atheism as a reaction, as a denial of this specifically Christian and Jewish religious notion, you don't understand modern atheism. You cannot be reduced to the simple denial of the ancient gods. This is why, you know, in the notion argues that historically, atheism is the end, modern atheism is the end point of a process that doesn't start atheistically, but starts rationalistically. So if you read the book, yeah, the chapter, he says that people did not deny God first. People denied original sin first. Okay? That's his theory. That if you look at people like Hegel, Spinoza, Giordano Bruno, the libertines, the philosophers between, say, the 1500s and the 1800s, before Marx and before Nietzsche, their denial was often either deistic or immanentist. I mean, they didn't care to deny God, but they wanted to bring down God down to the size of human reason. Now think of Kant, you know, religion within the boundaries of reason, right? And he thinks that this denial is the first denial, that then consistently must also lead to the denial of God. But if you don't understand Hegel, you don't understand Marx, for example. So in his view, ultimately, rationalism can be understood as the affirmation of the, he calls it the normalcy, normality was the good word, of the human condition. That there is nothing wrong with us, right? There is an option that we are fine, that ultimately there is not a tragic, dramatic predicament that we face, but that we are okay. I'm okay, you're okay. That death is natural. This is all Hegel, right? I mean, there are some great chapters by Hegel, but about the philosopher accepts death, and later on the eternal return. The fundamental option of rationalism is that the human condition is not defective, it's normal, and death is natural. And God can be the deistic God, you know, could be the great Masonic architect of the universe, can be the Hegelian world spirit, it can be Spinoza's Deus sive natura. You know, there is all this collection of rationalistic God. And so according to the notion, you don't understand modern atheism, it's not going to be starting point in rationalism. Now, when modern atheism develops, according to the notion, there is one fundamental dichotomy, which I don't think is in this chapter I gave you, but it is somewhere else in the book. The notion thinks that there are fundamentally 2 or 3 types of atheists. When rationalism leads to atheism, you have 2 or 3 possibilities. And the most important 2 are what he calls negative and positive atheists. So I have a couple more minutes, I want to explain this thing. To the notion, a negative atheist is an atheist who recognizes that abolishing God means that our life is meaningless, right? So a negative atheist, in a sense, regards God as desirable because God would be mean, and the definition there is meaning. So the negative atheist is pessimistic, Schopenhauer, with the Italian poet Leopardi. In some sense, Simone Weil before our conversion to what extent, right? The negative atheist is convinced that the denial of God coincides with the affirmation of the misery of the human condition, right? The human condition is bad because there is no meaning, there is no God. The Noche is very friendly towards negative atheists because he thinks that the negative atheist is serious about the religious question, about the religious problem, and so he will ultimately go around. He thinks that both if you look at Leopardi and Simone Weil, serious negative atheists often, by taking seriously this misery, rediscover God. What's the difference with the positive atheist? To the notion, the positive atheist is the atheist that says that I can create the meaning, right? Negative atheist, there is no meaning. Positive atheist, I can create the meaning, okay? And in particular, I can save the world, right? Because if the negation of God was rooted in the negation of original sin, the negative atheist recognizes that human condition is flawed, that we are in, bad in some sense, right? The positive atheist believes that that in order to deny God, you have to prove that our condition is, again, good, that we can be good. So the positive atheist has to move evil from the individual to society. And has to, in a sense, move the nature of rationality from philosophy to politics. Right? This is the notion big idea. That the positive atheist has to shift rationality from philosophy to political rationality. Why? Because the positive atheists believe in the possibility of bringing heaven to earth, the possibility of redeeming the human misery, putting an end to the human misery, or filling the gap left, the vacuum, the void left by God. Now you see the way you read Marx. That's why the notion regards Marx as the prototype, because Marx says it's a view of alienation, that we project on God the misery due to social oppression. If we remove oppression, we don't need God anymore. We are going to fix the problem of God by removing the oppression that created this dream of God, right? So you see that the positive atheist is still around. If you look around in our society, there is many positive atheists, because according to the notion, the positive atheist doesn't even care about refuting God, right? The positive atheist does not pick up Thomas Aquinas and try to refute the 5 proofs of God. The positive atheist goes down and becomes a politician, right? The positive atheist, because he thinks that politics can create the meaning, can make life meaningful and change the world, right? Of course, this idea that evil lies in society, not in individual, was already present in Rousseau. Right? In the idea that man is born free, but society keeps us in chains. But in Rousseau, it was still based, right? Rousseau is still in the sense of religious. The Noche regards Marx as the confluence where the atheism of the Enlightenment meets Rousseau's idea of revolution. And so the revolution becomes the substitute for religion sometimes. For the positive atheist, the idea of political change. Now, today we don't call it revolution anymore because after communism and so on, the word was discarded. But the idea of change, the idea of man-made redemption of the world is the religion of the positive atheist. I'm wondering with
you joined me about 4 minutes.
All right. That's why the Noche goes at great length in analyzing what he calls revolutionary thought. Okay? Revolutionary thought is besides this faith in history, faith that there is going to be a redemption which is brought around by the logic of history. And then once these contradictions are overcome, the need for God will be revealed as an illusion. Right. So the conclusion is that the positive atheist in the Noche's view does not just deny God, but denies the question of God, right? And this is another thing that he emphasized a lot, that you don't understand modern atheism as opposed, say, to the older forms of atheism. If you don't understand that the modern positive atheist just wants to uproot the question, not to deny the answer, right? Okay. This is a very visible, in my opinion, in American English culture, because if you think of a classical English-speaking atheist, you will think of Bertrand Russell. Think of Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell is what the Noche would call a scientific atheist. A scientific atheist kind of takes seriously the question of God, because of your question, and he tries to answer it. And he has all these answers, which says, like, this kind of doesn't make sense. God is like the teapot orbiting the sun. I don't know what it says. The great spaghetti monster. But that's a great spaghetti monster. I forget. It's not. I don't know. If you look on the internet, all the scientific atheist is an atheist that at least thinks that denying God is worth his time or her time, right? It's worthwhile to deny God involving science, the Big Bang. The universe is eternal or not, and or maybe Stephen Hawking is another example of a scientific atheist. For the Noche, this kind of scientific atheist is a little more primitive, a little less developed than full positive politicized atheist, because a full positive politicized atheist does not care about telling you about the spaghetti monster, but he cares just to tell you that all this talk about religion is a false consciousness, is a cover for the fact that there is racism, there is oppression, there is all this injustice, which is true, of course, and that we have to work to ameliorate the human condition, and we can. There's nothing fundamentally wrong about us. Remember, no original sin. The original sin is the original denial of modernity, according to the Noce. And so you see that the conclusion is that at the end of the day, religion is not destroyed by an open persecution. It's destroyed by removing the question. Right? If you remove the religious question, the answer doesn't make sense. As Reinhold Niebuhr said, I believe, there's nothing as to win as providing an answer for a question that has not been asked. Right? So the note that this is the nature of post. Of course, the logic then thinks that Marx is not the end of the story. I think that Marx is the beginning of a process in some senses to fall apart because the revolution never happens or it never comes to fruition. And then really every time the revolution is attempted, you create a stronger bourgeois society. You know, because by destroying the old structures, the old in the Noce's view, there is the next book I should translate. It's called The Suicide of the Revolution. The Noce thinks that revolutions always commit suicide because they do the destruct, the pars destruct, which they can criticize and destroy, but ultimately they fail to bring about the world without sin, you know, the reign of freedom. And then what happens is that they actually feed into their enemy. Okay, to the Noce, every revolutionary attempt from this positive atheistic perspective strengthens its enemy, right? And so communists brought around a more extreme form of capitalism. Marcuse and the sexual revolution brought around a more extreme form of alienation, psychological misery, and reflection. And we don't need to do it. But the point I was trying to say is this idea that in the Noce's group, the full developed form of atheism is not so much a philosophical negation of God in a scientific sense anymore, but it is a systematic denial of the religious question, the religious sense of the religious dimension.
Well, I think the place plan. I'm going to maybe ask one question, but then we'll